Folks, this is Harold Goldberg from the New York Video Game Critics Circle. I'm the president and founder of the Circle and games critic for the New York Times. And this is our Playing with Purpose podcast. Today we have something really interesting. We have member of the Circle from PopMatters, Luis Aguasvivas, and he's going to be interviewing Remy Siu about 1000xRESIST, this awesome game we've all been talking about at the Circle, and possibly one of the games of the year. We'll see at our New York Game Awards. And the New York Game Awards actually takes place on Tuesday, January 21st, 2025, again at SVA Theater at 8 p.m. So we have tickets on sale on Eventbrite, and you can go to nygamecritics.com to learn more about our awards. It's going to be an awesome show. It may be our best yet, or certainly one of our best yet. And so be sure to follow NYVGCC on Twitter and Instagram for updates about pretty much everything we do. And don't forget to like our podcast on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and catch up on our other podcasts with Ben Starr, Megaran, and a bunch of good folks. And if you want to support what we're doing, you can make a donation at nygamecritics.com/donate. I think about coming to the New York Game Awards. We've been working hard on it since August. It's October now. It's all coming together. So we'll have more reveals about what we're about to do. And the last thing I want to say, this is called Playing with Purpose. Our nonprofit is primarily working with underserved and unhoused kids. Our newest class is maybe our most awesome class ever. It's at the Lab School in the Bronx. So we have 4 mentors there, 3 days a week, teaching game journalism and playing games, and also writing games narratives. So we're really happy about that. So with us today is the founder of the really in-depth, narrative-oriented indie game studio, Sunset Visitor, and the creator of 1000xRESIST, which is available on Steam and Nintendo Switch. So I'm going to toss this to Luis and Remy will have this awesome conversation, and then I'll see you later in the show.
All right, thank you, Harold, and thank you, Remy, for joining us. I've been a huge fan of 1000xRESIST since I first played it. It really captivated me, and honestly, it is my game of the year. I doubt it will be beat by anything else. And it's one of the most remarkable narrative experiences I've ever had in any medium. The only video games that I think that come close in the past 10 years are things like Kentucky Route Zero and Disco Elysium, really. But your game is definitely unique in its own right, and it carves its own path. So I want to thank you and thank Sunset Visitor for making such a wonderful and just profound work of art. If we can begin, I just want to just ask you a question a little bit about the role that video games have played in your life. I guess games that were a big part of your childhood, or ones that left an impression on you.
Yeah, absolutely. First, well, thank you for everything. I'm just kind of, yeah, games that I think gaming was something that I was really interested in because my cousins, they all had like a Game Boy, and they had a Super Nintendo, but I didn't have any consoles or any ways to play games at the time. And so early on, I think there were 2 branches of gaming that I did a lot of. One was I did a lot of gaming with my dad, who happened to be a computer engineer. And we had a PC around because of that, and we played point and click adventure games together. We played Indiana Jones: The Last Crusade, Monkey Island, and all those LucasArts point and click adventures. And so that was like maybe some of my earliest memories of playing games, and kind of really formed probably how I think about games, because you know I didn't really know how to play those games at the time. I also didn't really know how to read English or speak English at the time I was playing it. And so I think that one thing I remember most is that in Monkey Island, you're supposed to go and get a sword. Um, and I went into a shop, and I just got stuck at this one puzzle because I just didn't know what the word browsing meant. I thought browsing meant borrowing. Um, and so so for like months, I just didn't know what to do. And so I really just kind of walked around Melee Island and talked to everybody that I could. And I got really immersed in the world. Um, and so that that was an interesting experience. Like I still think, like I still primarily play narrative games, and I still think about games as world building and moving in these kind of virtual spaces, which I think was something that these LucasArts point and click adventure games really kind of situated me in quite early. The other branch was that I got a PlayStation 1 when I was still quite young, because I think at that point, um, all my cousins had some form of console, and I was like making cardboard consoles, um, and so then I guess at one point my parents decided it was okay for me to have a console. They were worried about actually getting one for me, um, and so that was this early 3D era, this experimentation in the early PlayStation 1 era that also probably made a huge influence on me. And of course I then played Final Fantasy 7 when I was quite young, like really maybe perhaps too young to really understand what was going on. And so I did the same thing, which was just walking around Sector 7 slums, talking to everybody, and kind of getting immersed in the world. And so um, I think those are some of my kind of really influential childhood gaming experiences. A lot of the time, just not knowing what to do and then deciding to hang out in that world for a really long time before actually playing the game, I guess. Um, yeah.
Yeah, that I have some similar experiences too. I mean, English isn't my first language, so I definitely do remember playing games, all of them, you know, in English, the text at least in English, and just not knowing what to do, and you're just messing around with like button inputs and trying to
Yeah.
see, where you can get to. And I do have a lot of really, let's just say, interesting experiences with the Final Fantasy series regarding that. Um, trying to play those games. It makes a lot of sense though. It's Final Fantasy VII as making an impression on you, especially after playing something like 1000xRESIST and seeing how now your game is up for a joystick award alongside Final
Yeah,
Fantasy
that
VII, the remakes. Um, like I said, personally, I think what you have is, I think it's more potent than than what the Final Fantasy VII remakes are trying to do. But so I wish you
thank
the best of luck
you.
on that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's going to be an uphill battle.
Yeah. But it's great to see your game getting this recognition. And if we can, I guess, move on a little, just before we talk about 1000xRESIST prop, just if you can tell me a little bit about, the formation of Sunset Visitor, um, and just a little bit about your background before you started, you went on the path to make games, which is such a hard ordeal. Just so, it takes so much just multidisciplinary skill.
Yeah. Um, so I guess my background is in music composition. I think I was interested in writing fiction as a kid. Um, I was really restless at school, and so I ended up putting my energy into writing fiction while I was at school, which was not something that my teachers liked a lot. And the after that, I did go to art school for music composition. I was going to study film, but then for some reason, I made a last minute decision to study music, even though I hated playing the piano. Not because my piano teacher was bad or anything. I don't know if she's going to listen to this. I just think that I just didn't like the instrument, or it didn't resonate with me. And I think that's all over the game. But the the um, I did I did go into music composition. I studied there, and I think I got very lucky because I went to a pretty radical kind of, at least its roots in kind of a radical school, Simon Fraser University here in Vancouver, kind of a very young university. And they had an arts program that was also very young, which was home to things like the World Soundscape Project, and also Barry Truax and the real-time granular synthesis machine, the XPod, um, that he had made. And I don't think I could have studied music anywhere else. I wasn't a good enough musician to actually get into. But that school was interested in taking anybody off the street and turning them into a composer, and thinking about a composition as anything that was time based. And so there, I was able to kind of work with a lot of my peers. The school's like very porous. The mediums are very porous with one another. And so I worked with a lot of dancers, a lot of theater performers, um, doing devised performances. And from there, I got into live electronics, trying to keep up with the devised performers, because they're moving on their feet all the time, and they're either improvising or they're moving, and I had to find a way to keep up with them. That extended to working with lights, real time lights, and real time 3D, and then I started using Unity to do works for gallery, for rendering, 3D rendering. And then the pandemic happened, and like before the pandemic, and before starting the company, the way that I made my living, I guess, was touring performance works to festivals and doing curation and things like this. And so during the pandemic, everything was pretty devastated. The performing arts circuit was pretty devastated, and I think is still recovering. And so I had just made the decision pretty early on in the pandemic that, like, okay, if I'm going to try and make video games, which is an aspiration of mine for a long time, this seemed to be the opportune time to do it. I have really nothing else to do. And this is the only way I can really practice. And so that's kind of the beginning of the 1000xRESIST prototype. We eventually got some funding, and then I founded the company proper and brought on the team. Very lucky with everybody that we were able to bring on. Everybody, they were all MVPs. And so that's kind of how it happened.
Yeah, that's a fascinating background. And Simon Fraser University, it's a place that I've always like heard of, and I've encountered a few people that went there. I think the creator of Counter-Strike went there, if I'm not.
What?
I remember like reading someplace. Yeah, I think that
Yeah.
I forget their names, like Ming Lee or something, who created essentially the mod off of Half-Life
Uh-huh.
that became Counter-Strike.
No
So
way. That's
yeah,
wild.
I don't remember where I read that, but it's when I heard you say that, that automatically the light bulb came on. It's like, oh wow. It's it's definitely it's definitely interesting to hear your your interdisciplinary background. And I know that I've read and heard you speak before, talking about how you do a lot of work when it comes to creative coding. If you can just like talk a little bit about that, and like what role did it play in 1000xRESIST?
Yeah. so I guess when creative coding, my way into, so the Simon Fraser, traditionally it's electroacoustic music, um, kind of curriculum was a tape music curriculum, um, and that was kind of rooted in soundscape, and that's because of Barry Truax and the World Soundscape Project with Armory Schaefer. Um, but then while I was there was a transition, and so there was a transition towards live electronics and Max MSP. And so Max MSP was the very first kind of visual coding, creative coding framework that I used. I actually kind of bounced off it really for a while. Like I was like kind of not interested in it. I think at the time I was like super interested in notation for whatever reason. And then um, I I bounced off Max, but what really got me back into it was using a program called and you may know this, Isadora, named after the dancer Isadora Duncan, and it's by another theater kind of deviser, creative coder, and um, I can't pronounce his last name, but his name is Mark um, Colignio, I, I I think. And so Isadora was a really great introduction into visual coding for me again, which was something I could use immediately. It was designed to be used in rehearsal and in theater and in rehearsal spaces. And so that means it was really quick. Um, and it had very simple, quote unquote, like syntax, so that you could keep up with the performers while they were doing their thing. Um, and after kind of using Isadora for many years, making work for stage, I switched to also using Touch Designer, which is a real time branch from Houdini. So it's a company based actually in Toronto, and I guess it's like a real time Houdini. So it doesn't have all of the kind of features that Houdini has, but it is geared towards being run in real time. And so I think like they use Touch Designer, as far as I understand it, like at things like BlizzCon, to like be able to communicate with, like, I don't know, 60 screens simultaneously. They used it on one of the newer Alien movies to design and do in real time um, the displays for spaceships and stuff like this. I believe they also used it in Gravity, the movie Gravity, Alfonso Cuarón's Gravity, to do previs for Sandra Bullock um, while she's like floating around in space or something. But we also use it a lot in kind of new media spaces, and so um, that that was something that really opened my mind, like the way that Touch Designer worked, um, and thinking about work that way. I think that that kind of helped me um, get into Unity. I think one of the repeated things that happens to me is that when I try to go learn something, I bounce off of it almost immediately, and I just have to like wait a year for whatever reason, and then when I come back, it's like I can I can actually really get into it. I don't know why that is. Um, and so, but Touch Designer and Real Time 3D was a way into Unity and thinking about. I learned so many things in Touch Designer that while using Touch Designer that I did employ in the game. Um, some of it is boring, not boring, I shouldn't say. Some of it is very technical, like thinking about being able to just know even what a shader does, um, and other parts are just thinking about control flow and stuff like this. So um, I think I wouldn't be able to kind of do the generalist role that I do at the company if I didn't have that kind of background.
No, yeah, thank you very much for that. And it's really interesting to hear how software that most people don't really know about it, and it is something that's mainly used like within like experimental like theater space, led you to use Unity, which is one of the most like commonly used, you know, software to make games now. And just just for our audience, we're gonna take a short break, and when we'll return, we'll have more questions for the founder and creative director of Sunset Visitor, Remy Siu.
The Playing with Purpose podcast is brought to you by the New York Video Game Critics Circle. The New York Video Game Critics Circle is a nonprofit organization that brings comprehensive games journalism and games narrative classes direct to schools in underserved communities across New York City. Students are given unique opportunities, like writing game reviews for nygamecritics.com, creating games with Twine, and conducting interviews with gamers and game industry icons, like this very episode. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to go to nygamecritics.com to learn more. And head on over to nygamecritics.com/donate to donate to this incredible cause. And now, back to the show.
So, and now we're back, and we're back with Remy Siu, the creative director and founder of Sunset Visitor, whose game 1000xRESIST is you've probably heard of. It's awesome. If you haven't, try it out yourself and be amazed. Just so, Remy, you were talking a little bit about how you started, I guess, using Unity as a essentially just like a natural progression of your experimentation with creative coding and experimental theater, which I think is very poignant, because I think a lot of people, the analog that they draw between art when it comes to video games, like the closest analog usually is like film, but I've always thought at it to actually be theater, especially experimental theater, where you have like just so many uses of like multimedia. At the same time, you might have like live projection that's being used, and and it's changing like real time, where you have like actors, you have like mise en scene, music, etc. And that's something that really comes out in a game like 1000xRESIST. It's this. I know it's not, but to me, oftentimes it really did feel like I was like watching like a play. And it's not just in the sense that there's dialogue. Obviously, there's like voice actors, but there's a quality to that game that just really speaks to, okay, the people who are making this like have this background in theater or in all their like multidisciplinary arts, and it really shows. If you can just talk just about how the game came to be, how 1000xRESIST came to be, and just where are you with the game now, right after months of its release, after you working on it for, I'm guessing from my research, it's close to 4 years now total, if not more.
For me, it was 4 years. I think for everybody else, it was 3. So our kind of proper production cycle was 3 years. And I think it really did come. I mean, one of the interesting things that we do in devised performance is that, like, if we get into a room with performers, we generally just try to make anything with the things that we have in the room. And I think that was one of the earliest, when working on the prototype, it was like, okay, well, what do I have? What do I think I can do? I'm still learning to work with C# and Unity at the time. And then I subsequently stopped programming for the game because we got a really great programmer, and I was so happy not to have to do it. It was just really kind of thinking about, okay, what do I think, how can I make a contribution? And maybe that's also something from the arts background where, as an artist, especially a freelance artist or someone who's making their own work, you do have to take a step back and be like, okay, where can I make a contribution? I think what allows me to kind of get in here and do something that maybe for whatever reason, in whatever circumstance, it may be more difficult for others to do. So that's kind of how we came to thinking about the game as like, okay, we think we really wanted to to have it as an experiment of like, we have a specific devised performance background. It's rooted very much in a kind of Vancouver locality. Like, it's influenced by our mentors there, and it's also influenced by the fluxus and conceptual art in Vancouver. And so we wanted to take that lineage or that train of thought and be like, okay, can we put this in a game, and can we actually bring this to more people than we're used to, and will they care at all? And so throughout the development, we were always, at least I was being like, well, I don't know if they're gonna care. I hope they care, because really it was us putting forward the priorities that we had when we were just making work for stage, I guess, or work for performing arts, or for gallery. So, and much of how it was made kind of reflected that we did make it chapter by chapter. And so we made kind of like 10 games, 10 smaller games sequentially, it felt like. There being 10 chapters, I should say. And when we finished one chapter, we would move on to the next. But I think one of the reasons why we did this is that, in a devised practice, at least for us, we really stressed a what you see is what you get environment. And so when we were doing rehearsals, I would make sure to always have all the lights, all the speakers, all the projectors or whatever, as much as we could set up so that what we're seeing is what we're going to get on stage largely. And so that so it's not something that we would add on afterwards, because if it comes afterwards, basically our thought is always that if we're not thinking about it, if we don't have it and we're not playing with it from day one, it's just not going to end up in the show. We're just going to make a show without that stuff. And it's going to be weird if we add that stuff at the end during like tech week or something. And so, we really treated it that way for the game, where we're moving from one chapter, and then we wanted to see that chapter in its entirety so that we can make better decisions about what to do next. Not even just decisions, but be able to riff on our own discoveries. Because sometimes we would go and make a chapter and do certain things, and then play test it and reflect on it. And they would be doing certain things or have done things that we didn't expect, or didn't do things that we expected. And so it was really important to kind of pick it up from where we left off there to address in the next chapter. And we just kind of rolled that for the entire development. I think does that answer that part of the question a little bit?
Yeah, it definitely does. And I guess if you can talk a little bit more though about just like the game itself, right? Just what was like your mind state, and I guess for as much as you can speak on it, like the your colleagues and everybody else like working around, because I know that most of the game was being produced during the lockdown phase and the subsequent like weird liminal like time with the pandemic, where it's like you're outside but people still fairly and reasonably obviously like fearful, can be, and that definitely makes its way into the game, especially in the earlier chapters, and just throughout too. You see it, and other things too. Like the game just takes so much. It's really a game that really there's a criticism with a lot of games and game developers where it's like game developers, the only thing they know is games, right? For lack of better words, it's like making either like playing games. They might know a lot about it, but that's like really it. Outside of that, though, you don't really see much about like the real world or life experience. That's obviously not necessarily true, and it runs like the gamut, about a lot of different games that one plays. But it is something that I think it's just a criticism that's like that's like very like upfront. That's not the feeling with 1000 Times. It feels like, okay, these people have definitely had like life experience and are referring to things that are currently happening, if not have happened, and are still, people are still dealing with like the trauma and the effects of it.
Yeah, I mean, making it in the middle of the game exists because of the pandemic. That's 100%. And the other aspect is that we were really, again, a part of our device practice is that we like to be as porous as we can with the world around us. So, what's happening in the world while we're making um, the game? What's happening in our lives, and how can that come to feed the work that we're making right now? And kind of thinking back about the game, I'm starting to realize, like, 1000 times resist is really rooted in the years of 2019 and 2020. A lot of the things that it's really kind of obsessed about are things that were occurring in 2019 and 2020, and a lot of our thoughts at the time about it and how we were feeling, and how kind of and also a general sense is, at least with me and the writers, um, many of us being from, I think all three of us having ties to Hong Kong and being diaspora growing up in Vancouver or in Canada, um, we rarely got to see any media whatsoever really reflect that, and reflect that with it. At least, even like, I would even say the game that we make gets the whole aspect of it. There's so much of it, obviously, as you know, with any culture or any kind of um, diasporic community, and so that that was just um, even a small sliver of that we were not seeing in media, either in Canada or what we could find. And we were maybe sometimes frustrated by some of the media that we were seeing that was tangentially just kind of touching it a little bit, or was maybe close to it, not to their own fault, but we were just wanting to, we had a way that we wanted to approach it that we had been doing in our stage work, but really wanted to get at it um, in games. And so I do think that, yes, like the disease in the game, that's 100% influenced by the fact that we were living in the middle of a disease. The fact that they're isolated in the orchard is very much that of us all being isolated inside of our um, our homes, and also very specifically this feeling of alienation throughout the game, alienation um, through time, I guess, or maybe it's not through time, it's alienation of things that happened recently. um, and what, I don't know if this is a spoiler um, podcast, but like the second half of the game, I sometimes had hoped that like it would make you nostalgic, maybe sometimes, for the first half of the game, and that is very much a feeling that we were being nostalgic for something, like, we were being nostalgic for January 2020 in April 2020, and so like that was a very direct thing that was happening to us, that we, and I'm also really influenced by something like um Adventure Time, that operates on like huge scales as well of time, and the way that alienates viewers as well, as they kind of move around and in their timeline and chronology. So I think all of this stuff was kind of swirling around in our heads, and we also felt with the Hong Kong content just a way, that was weighing heavily on us, because all of that stuff that was happening then, and then continued to happen throughout the development of the game. And that was just something that we were burning to kind of, I wouldn't say depict, I think just like be a part of some kind of fictional science fiction world. That was just the desire, I guess. And I think earlier on in, I think it was like 2015, we had made some sort of science fiction kind of related um, Hong Kong content work in 2015. It was a very different situation then. Um, but at the time I remember reflecting like, okay, like we see Hong Kong in um so many science fiction mise en scène. So like we see it in Blade Runner, maybe more so in the first Blade Runner movie than the second. And we see it in games as well, like Stray. It's a long, and like Ghost in a Shell, of course, as well. There's a long history of that, but especially in more Western science fiction that borrows that imagery, we don't really get to see some of the concerns of the people there, whether it's locals or whether it's diaspora. So that was something, and there's a long that's been much talked about in terms of how science fiction imagery can borrow that, but not kind of be interested in the stories. And so that was another thing that we wanted to kind of to get at.
Yeah, no,
and
it's
even
effective.
then, yeah. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, I was gonna say it's effective. It's definitely effective in 1000xRESIST, where you do get that bigger. If players are familiar with with a lot of like the protests going on in Hong Kong, I mean, essentially, I guess it was really getting covered in Western press. It's like 2018 to 2020 until like the pandemic then happened, and obviously that attention like really changed. But that really you really get that sense in that game, and it's not only like in the broader sense with a lot of like symbolism and 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 a lot of references, but also like the interpersonal, like how it affects like it's almost like a chamber drama situation. And I think,
Yeah.
yeah, and it really shows, and it's really like effective because everybody's at home in the game. At least in the first few chapters, you get that when it comes with where Iris is, who's the All Mother, which not to get too much into spoilers, which is one of like the pivotal characters, which like everything is essentially at the beginning, everything essentially gravitates around her, right? Circles around her, and her family is dealing with like trauma um, from their experience. And I, just for the sake of time, if like I've really enjoyed the talk. I wish we had definitely more time, but that that's part of life. If you can just tell us just briefly, just like one question that arose from the completion of the game, right? Because this is something that you've been working on for so long. And I know for me personally, when it comes to any like artistic endeavor, I'm not really trying to find answers when I'm doing it. Maybe like certain points, but it's more for me, it's like to get at a question and, to get at a question that really like highlights like something that I consider to be important and crucial. What if anything comes to mind? What question came out of like the creation of 1000xRESIST?
What question I would what question that it asks, or what question I
Or
ask
that you
myself after?
that came, yeah, for you, it's a very like in a personal matter from the creation of.
Yeah,
First thing that
I
comes to mind. Yeah.
first thing that comes to mind. That's a good one. That's a good question. I would say that especially for me and one of the writers, Pinky, we've been thinking about Hong Kong and science fiction and all of this stuff for a relatively long time. And now that we've done with the game as it is right now, one of the things is that we're very listless. I mean, it seems like a simple question. We're asking ourselves, what now? Like,
Yeah.
that is, but I think maybe for more, like what I said earlier was that, yeah, 2019, 2020 was something that the game leaned so heavily on. And if we were ever to do something in the similar line, it's just like, I feel like time needs to pass. Like we're basically like, I'm not answering this very well.
No,
Basically, we're like
I understand.
lifting
It's
our head
supposed to
up and
be.
we're like looking around right now at the world, and we're
Yeah,
just like,
but
well, what's what's happening
I mean,
now.
you can sit on that a little
yeah,
bit longer, and I guess post the
yeah,
answer on your social media, right?
yeah,
So, which I mean, let's select our final question, which is,
yeah.
where can people find you like online, right? To know like what you're working on next, to hear from you, learn more about the game, and to get an answer to that last question. Yeah.
Yeah, follow me to find out this question I didn't know I couldn't answer. You can follow me at Remy Siu, REMYSIU on Twitter and Blue Sky, and then at 1000 times resist. That's 1000xRESIST on Twitter, and on Blue Sky we are Sunset Visitor.
Well, thank you very much, Remy Siu, creative director and founder of Sunset Visitor, creators of 1000xRESIST, a game that will just grow in stature. Like it's a classic. So
Thank you.
listeners, you owe it to yourself to play it.
We just heard Remy and Luis talk at length about something that's near and dear to my heart, not only 1000 times resist, and not only the process of creating a game, but what goes into a game is not only the iteration during the game, but the history of one's life. In this case, Remy had dealt with learning about performance art, learning about making music, learning about writing fiction. And all of this is woven into 1000 times resist. So we want to thank Remy and Luis for taking the time with our Playing with Purpose podcast. And we'll see you next time. We're going to go actually in depth with Luis about a story he wrote. And I think the topic will be what game playing is like when you're very ill, because I have one or two stories about that as well. So perhaps we could riff on that. In the meantime, check out our student work at nygamecritics.com. And also, if you like our work, go to nygamecritics.com/donate and give us a couple of dollars. But thank you again, Remy and Luis, for taking the time. It was very insightful.